Welcome, viewers and listeners, to CHP Talks. I'm here with a repeat guest, Mr. Tom Harris. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, hi.
And by way of introduction, Tom Harris is Executive Director of ICSC Canada. That's the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, a federally incorporated not-for-profit coalition of scientists, economists, and energy and policy experts working to promote a better understanding of climate science and to foster a rational, evidence-based discussion about sensible and realistic responses to climate change. Mr. Harris has 30 years' experience as a mechanical engineer, a project manager, science and technology communications professional, a technical trainer, and science and technology advisor to a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's Parliament. And for the past 14 years, he's been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to a range of energy and environmental topics, climate change in particular. Mr. Harris is regularly published in newspapers in Canada and the US, occasionally in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and other countries. He's often interviewed on radio and occasionally on TV. Mr. Harris is the past executive director of the Natural Resources Stewardship Project. He's one of hundreds of policy advisors to the Heartland Institute. And today, we're privileged again to have him as a guest on CHP Talks. And welcome again, Tom. And although I'd love to go in depth into some of your deep and profound scientifically based thoughts on climate, we'll probably touch on that as we go, but today I'm going to be asking you about political climate change and the danger we are in of going into a totalitarian state if we don't get a handle on censorship and not carbon emissions, but candidate omissions.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, exactly. What we're seeing more and more is that the politicians have to either agree with the climate scare or at least dare not contest it if they have any chance to get elected. And we want to change that, of course, because I mean, the whole point is climate always changes. If it weren't for climate change, we'd have 2 kilometers of ice over my head right now. So when Greenpeace come to the door and they say, oh, will you contribute to help us stop climate change? I say, will you stop the next ice age? Because, of course, we're overdue for the next ice age. We've been in a climate, what they call interglacial period, which is a warm period. And that could end anytime in the next 1,000 years. We don't know exactly when. And if we return to that condition, all of Canada in the last glacial period, except for a small area of the Yukon, which they call a refugia. It was cold, but it didn't have enough precipitation for there to build up in ice. And so animals would retreat to that area, and they find lots of interesting bones from ice age animals. But yeah, climate change is real. Humans have a contribution. There's no question that when we build a city and cut down forests and put up parking lots, we have climate change. Certain degree of that can be 2 or 3 degrees warmer than it is in the countryside. So there's no question there. The question really is, are our greenhouse gases causing climate change so dangerous that it's worth spending trillions of dollars changing our complete energy and other infrastructure? And we don't believe it is. And, even just looking at some of the statistics, Rod, for example, since 1880, 142 years, even the UN says that the so-called global average temperature has only gone up 1.2 degrees Celsius. And now you wouldn't feel that in your lifetime. In fact, it's interesting. People like Richard Lindzen say, if there weren't climatologists and meteorologists to tell us about it, we would never feel it in our lifetime. So what's happening politically is various governments are declaring climate emergencies. The federal government declared it, the city of Ottawa declared it, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, they all declared these emergencies. Not only that, they're signing something called a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. In other words, they're treating fossil fuels like natural gas as if they are like nuclear weapons, which is kind of crazy to say the least. I mean, even for coal, if you go back far enough, England was largely dependent on their forests, for their energy. And so they were in danger of completely denuding the island of all trees. And when coal came along, that stopped. So while coal was quite dirty at the beginning, it's now very clean. We have all sorts of devices to take pollutants out of the effluents. I have a piece of coal here from Eastern Kentucky, for example. Here we go. Yeah, I picked this up when I was down there giving a presentation. People say, oh, this is old technology. Well, coal is, of course, not technology. It's just a natural resource. How you burn it is what matters, okay, and how you mine it. So like everything in this world, there's no black and white, except that this is very black. But the thing is, you see, the politicians, they seem to think that fossil fuels are equivalent to nuclear weapons, and they're signing these really nonsensical treaties. Now, recently in the Ottawa election, they were trying very hard to get a climate activist elected as mayor. And she was the one, Catherine McKenney, she was the one who actually promoted the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that Ottawa signed. Not only that, in addition to the climate emergency declaration, they put out something called the Climate Change Master Plan and Energy Evolution. And here's what it was, it's so ridiculous. One of the fellows who I know, Joseph Benamy, who was a candidate in my ward, he said when he looked at these different plans, he said it was like going to bed one night in the normal world, and then he woke up the next morning and he was in a Harry Potter movie. He said, this is like magical thinking, the kinds of things that they were going to do. And they may still do. I don't think they will now that we don't have that activist as mayor. But believe it or not, they want to put up 710 industrial wind turbines taller than the Peace Tower. I mean, that's completely crazy. They have to be at least a half a kilometer from a home, from any dwelling. They should be typically more like 1 kilometer. And of course, they can't be too close together because there's a wind shadow behind the turbine so that you don't get any, you get a lot less wind right behind the turbine. They also want to put up 36 square kilometers of solar panels. So we wrote a report about this at the beginning of the year. It was published, and we showed, and we weren't questioning the science at that point. Okay, because we wanted people to start to feel what pain was coming. $57.4 billion for a city of about 1 million. That works out to almost $60,000 for every man, woman, and child in Ottawa. We would actually see a massive reduction in our energy security as well. And of course, in a city that gets to minus 30, I mean, it's one of the coldest cities in the world, that's a real problem. And the strange thing, Rod, is they were only planning, in the adaptation section of these documents, they were only planning for warming. Now, if you look across the world, 20 times more people die from cold than from heat. And they didn't even talk about cold, even though we're the 7th coldest capital city in the world. So the plan was ludicrous and very, very expensive. It was totally infeasible, running all of our buses on electricity, for example, not paying any attention to what happened in the winter in Germany, where half of them broke down in the winter. So we put out a report on this plan. And as the election evolved, we sent an open letter. We basically started to make the public aware that this was really crazy. But to give you an idea, I should just list what happened in the election, which, in my opinion, is complete corruption. First of all, the first 4 debates between candidates for mayor, everyone was on climate justice. They didn't talk about police. They didn't talk about the potholes in our roads. They didn't talk about taxes. They only talked about climate. And the principal organizers, and for the first 3 debates, the moderators of these debates were climate activists. And they finally, it's interesting because we actually started to inject into the debates that were public, difficult questions. For example, Catherine McKenney, who was the leading candidate for mayor at the beginning, good 35% rise back in July. She was 35% ahead of the next candidate, which is Mark Sutcliffe. She said, when I asked her in the first debate, she said, because I was showing her how Texas, had a disaster because they were too dependent on wind power. She said that she didn't think that wind power played a really very major role in their plans, and that it was more focused on solar, district energy, and reducing greenhouse gases. So that's what she said. Well, one of the teammates that I worked with, because we established a group called Project Trumpet. We actually worked ahead of time to decide what kind of questions to ask. We actually practiced with microphones and, practiced what would you do when they don't answer the question, things like that. So we were using Alinsky's rules, basically. And what we ended up doing in that case is a lady got to the microphone 2 debates later, and she said, "You said X, okay? But that is deceptive and wrong." Okay, we said that directly. She said that. And the reason it's deceptive, of course, is because district energy doesn't say anything about the source of the energy. It only talks about the distribution of it. And it was wrong because it turned out that wind power was triple the amount of solar power that was in the plan. So the question our Project Trumpet person asked, she said, "Did you vote for a $57 billion plan without reading it first?"
Yeah.
Okay, so, we had influx in that way. Now, the interesting thing is that question was deleted by Rogers Community TV and the answers, because, of course, Catherine McKenney didn't answer that question, which I think is actually against CRTC rules. I mean, I have various friends who are getting back to me on that and will probably register a complaint. So anyway, the debates moved forward. They managed to eliminate from the fourth debate, the most important one in the climate area, the one candidate who most disagreed with Catherine McKenney on these different energy plans. And they also eliminated Ade Alamid, because Ade Alamid was a black fellow, and he pointed out that McKenney's plan for $250 million more on bicycle paths, which was a 1,250% increase, didn't really make any sense in a city that couldn't afford to properly fund their drug rehab centers or homeless problems. So he was making quite a noise about this. And of course, people were saying, yeah, like, that's pretty crazy. You Cadillac bicycle paths, but you have people living under bridges. I mean, so they managed to eliminate him as well from the fourth debate. Now, so there was tons of corruption going on, but we didn't actually promote any candidate. We didn't say, don't vote for her, do vote for him, whatever. We just focused on the issue. And her signature issue was the climate change. And in the final analysis, she lost. So the question is, and we don't know the answer, of course, is what influence did we have? I don't know. But we did presentations, we did Zoom calls, we went to 7 of the 8 mayor debates, handed out our flyer. We risked the verbal attacks from environmental activists. We did get some of those. And we had, one of our people actually stood up and interrupted the last debate, which wouldn't take questions. And you'd laugh to hear how they chose the questions, okay? In the last debate, it was hilarious. You had to submit your question to a local association, who would then submit the question to the host association, all these community associations, very left wing, and they would choose the question to be asked. Mm-hmm. And not only that, the question would be asked by the CBC moderator, who, of course, was a very strong climate activist moderator. So the whole thing was really rigged, and it looked like, Catherine McKenney was going to win. But, I'm really proud of Ottawa. They voted her out, totally out, because she was a councillor before. And so she was, of course, one of the people responsible for this insane plan. But the bottom line is, when you run for mayor, you have to resign your council seat. So now she's out of municipal politics completely. So again, it's hard to know how much our impact had. The police, believe it or not, the Ottawa Police Association put out a damning video on her, because she had supported various things like defund the police and calling the police racist and all sorts of things. And they were very, very aggressive and said, they didn't say, oh, we're not telling you who to vote for, but they really condemned her directly and personally. So, we didn't do that, of course, but what we did do is we injected enough doubt, I think, into the public mind about the wisdom of their current climate plans that, yeah, people looked at her and said, I don't know if we really want to have an activist as mayor.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you had the privilege of having how many, 7 debates did you have?
It's 7 of the 8 debates, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so you had a chance to regroup and refocus in between here
Yeah.
in well, Smithers, close to where I live. There was one debate, right? And so no chance to sort of refocus in that way. But it sounds like you were very well organized. You put forward, you put out brochures, you distributed literature, you had interviews. So it went way beyond just these debates.
Oh, yeah.
I'm interested in the two gentlemen who were denied access to the fourth debate. Now, did they remain on the ballot? They were still candidates?
Yes, they were. But Mike McGuire, who was the one who was the strongest in his opposition to the climate plan, a very practical candidate, he actually explained how you could not run the city on wind and solar power. Ottawa is not just talking about this insane climate plan, they're actually doing things right now. For example, the natural gas pipeline along Saint Laurent Boulevard, which is a major street in Ottawa, it's over a half a century old. So Enbridge wanted to replace it. But the city said, oh, no, we're going to run the city on wind and solar power. And sadly, when it went to the Ontario Energy Board, this was just before the provincial election. And they didn't want to be accused, I guess, of being climate change deniers. So they agreed with the city. They let the city basically stop this project. And at some point, they're going to have to close it because it's going to become dangerous. So hopefully with the new mayor, they'll revisit that. The city also is planning to spend $1 billion, okay, $1 billion on buying electric buses. But their own auditor general said, but you haven't trialed them in the winter. Yeah. And so, we made a big noise about that right from the beginning, saying, well, yeah, look at Germany, what happened there. So, yeah, we were giving this sort of input to the discussion starting right at the beginning, even before the election. And I think what happened is over time, that in addition to the Ottawa police statement, in addition to Mark Sutcliffe, who won, making the point that, yeah, you're going to have like a 1,250% increase in bike paths, at a time when we can't properly house people. So I think over time, and it's really quite interesting to look at the graph. It starts like this with McKenney up here and Sutcliffe down here. And over the 2 months, it went like, it just totally changed. Yeah. So I think people really woke up to the fact that if you have a climate activist as mayor, well, you'd better not count on reliable electricity.
Yeah. So the thing is, for the debate organizers to exclude two candidates, and try, appear as if this is a legitimate debate, but you're keeping the voices of two of the candidates out of the debate. And then for who was it, Global?
CBC.
That took out a question and answer from.
Oh, that was Rogers. Yeah.
Rogers.
And the other question, it's interesting because this fellow brought up a question in the first debate. He said, Ottawa represents 1/100th of 1% of world emissions. And we actually sent those numbers, the total amount of megatons of emission. We sent it to a climate expert in the United States who used the UN's climate models and forecast that the temperature change, if Ottawa went to net zero by 2050 and kept it that way all the way to the end of the 21st century, the temperature change of the Earth would be 1/10,000th of 1 degree. Yeah. So he went to the microphone and he said this, he explained it to them. And he said, how do you rationalize spending almost $60 billion for 1/10,000th of a degree? And here's what they said. And it was so ludicrous that he came back with another question in the third debate. And they said, well, we have to lead the world. We want to be champions, climate champions. All these countries will follow us. So he got to the mic in the third debate and he quoted them and he said, but you realize that China is building coal stations all over the planet. And in fact, it's interesting because the delta, the increase in coal consumption by China in the next 2 years, when you add it to India, is about 700 million tons per year. That's the increase. And that increase is more than the complete American consumption of coal.
Oh.
And so, I mean, and China, of course, has an out clause in the climate agreements. I think we've talked about this, where their first and overriding priority in the framework convention, which underlies the Paris Agreement, is poverty alleviation development. So they're not going to turn off their least expensive form of electricity, which of course is coal. And come 2030, when they're supposed to cap emissions and not increase any further, according to the Paris Agreement, they're going to go right through that. And people are going to say, oh, but the Paris Agreement said you have to reduce emissions. And they'll say, nope, we do not, because underlying the treaty is the fundamental rules. And they even asked the Chinese negotiator at the Peru UN conference in 2014 if they would renegotiate the framework convention, which basically gives them an out clause to increase forever. And you'd laugh, Rod, to hear what they said. The climate negotiator from China said to them, no, no, no. The purpose of the Paris Agreement is to enforce the framework convention, not to change it. So they've got a sweetheart deal, and they really know. So this fellow went to the mic and he said that he thought that was totally naive to think that China was going to follow Ottawa. And the counselors, McKenney and actually a couple of others, they essentially said, in fact, Professor Cadre, who was the professor from Ottawa U who was running for mayor, they said, yes, China would follow Ottawa. We will lead the world. We're going to go to the COP conference in Egypt, and we would pressure China to follow Ottawa. Now, the answer, and it was funny because as he was saying that, as Professor Cadre was saying that, somebody in the audience yelled out very clearly, not gonna happen.
Well, when our prime minister considers China a wonderful example because of their basic dictatorship,
oh yeah,
kind of used to being told by Ottawa or Canada or anybody else in the world how to run their country.
Yeah. So Rogers took that complete question and the answers totally out. Okay. So yeah, there was a ton of censorship going on there. So in the last debate, where they would only take your questions through those multiple filters, as I said, we did two things. First of all, we put in questions, like we're following their process. Everyone was canceled. They didn't take a single question on our side of the argument. The other thing is we put on the back of our flyer directing people to a survey, because we weren't actually saying, do you think climate change is dangerous or whatever? We were saying, do you think it's appropriate that climate change was the only focus of the first four debates, that the debates were run by climate activists, that they censored questions, that Rogers TV did this. So we actually started a poll, and we have a survey on our website asking people what they think of all this without actually swaying them. I mean, it was not a push poll. The answers were cycling randomly. And so it'll be interesting over time. We're going to have a look at it over the next few weeks to see what kind of answers we got. But that, I think, bothered people a lot, the censorship. And when our fellow got up and he actually interrupted the fourth debate, which the CBC tried very hard to shut him up, but he wouldn't shut up. He's a big bodybuilder guy with massive muscles, so that helped. He basically focused on the censorship. He said, go look at the Rogers video from the third debate. I asked an important question. If you don't see me there, it's because they censored me out. He said, why do we have censorship in a free democracy? And, that to me was one of the major points of this whole exercise, is to show people what's happening behind the scenes. A lot of people, and I suspect this is happening all across Canada. Like Calgary just declared a climate emergency. So there must have been a ton of lobbying happening ahead of that. And Rod, you'd laugh. Ottawa's plan is pretty darn expensive. Calgary's is more. Calgary's is $87 billion. $87 billion.
I think a lot of people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about millions and billions and trillions. It's sort of you lose. People don't know where you're going. But a billion is 1,000 million. And most of the people I know don't have a million to start with. Yeah, but a trillion, is 1,000 billion. It's you're not even comparing apples to oranges. 57 billion for a town, for a city of 1 million people is a phenomenal, unbelievable, fantastic amount of money.
Yeah.
And on a project that is likely not going to succeed or may even create worse environmental challenges than leaving things alone. And
that's right.
I know we're going to run short of time very quickly here, but if you could speak a little bit on, people have this idea that some people have, obviously Catherine McKenna
Yeah.
would have this idea that solar panels and wind power are completely clean, that compared to oil and gas and coal. Can you debunk that myth for a minute?
Yeah,
because,
for sure.
They're not clean.
No, they're not clean at all. In fact, the major source of a lot of the raw materials is either China or Chinese-controlled mines for cobalt in the Congo. For example, in the Congo, they have, well, I was reading 40,000 children. I've heard up to 100,000 children as young as 5 years old working in very dangerous mining conditions, breathing radioactive dust to get the cobalt, which is then shipped to China, and in many cases, undoubtedly using slave labor to make the batteries that are running our EVs in the West. The other point, of course, is that the wind turbines use what are called rare earth elements in the magnets at the top of the turbine to get more energy out of the wind, and those are primarily mined in China, okay, under terrible environmental conditions. It's interesting, Rod, the city in the world in China, I can't remember the name right now, but that produces more green energy, so-called green energy, than any other city in the world, is also one of the most polluted cities on the planet. Okay, so and of course the whole thing about wind turbines, it's very unfortunate because they are truly a bird and bat blender. Okay, they kill millions of birds and bats around the world. One wind farm in Altamont Pass in California, just one farm, has killed thousands of golden eagles. Okay, now wind farm activists will say, oh yes, but cats kill more birds than eagles. Or sorry, cats kill more birds than turbines. But I've never seen a cat kill a golden eagle. I mean, it might go the other way around. So the raptors are being wiped out. They're saying in Ontario, for example, with bats, that certain bat species will be driven to extinction because not only are they killed when they hit the blade or the blade hits them, but if they go in the low pressure zone behind the blade, their lungs burst and they drown in their own blood. It's a very miserable death, to say the least. And I have a friend who's a bat expert. He has bats in his conservation area. And he says that, yes, we'll be driving some bat species to extinction. And there's all kinds of other things, the various materials needed to make these turbines, to operate them. And how do you dispose of them afterwards? Fiberglass blades, you just can't recycle them. And of course, solar power. Just one quick example before we go. The Genesis solar station near Las Vegas, they have to pull all the desert tortoises out of their burrows before they actually do the construction and put them in a separate, different location. The estimate is that half of them will all die. So the whole idea that wind and solar power are environmentally friendly is crazy. Michael Moore, in his film Planet of the Humans, okay, he's a very left-wing, so-called progressive, but in this case, he was progressive. He actually tracked down all of the ways the wind and solar industry has deceived the public. And in fact, it shows that his movie, Planet of the Humans, it shows how wind and solar are probably the most dirty energy sources on the planet. So even if it were true that we were causing a climate crisis, wind and solar wouldn't stop it, and they're terrible for our environment anyways.
Yeah, well, thank you for that explanation there at the end, and thank you for the work that you and your team have done educating the voters of Ottawa during this debate, and really appreciate it. I saw the article the other day, that's why I gave you the call.
Yeah.
The article you had written on the Canada Free Press is where you had it published. The City of Ottawa municipal election has been poisoned with corruption, censorship, and intimidation. That's the title.
Oh, yeah. I just make one quick
Yeah.
message to people. If you have a town council that are trying to push through these insane climate plans, do contact us, because we can help people push back. We can show them what are the facts. We can actually, people can practice questions with us if they have open public hearings or debates, or they send letters to the editor or make phone calls to radio stations. So we do want to hear about it. If your council is trying to do anything even remotely like Ottawa, we can help you fight back.
Yeah, well, Tom Harris, thank you very much for being with us today. We'll put a couple of these links in our show notes. And I know you've got another interview coming right up. And so thank you for squeezing the time in to speak with us. And we've seen elections across the country. British Columbia, many cities had some disappointing results in terms of the wrong people getting in or getting back in, and I know parts of Ontario had the same thing, but at least you were able to educate the city of Ottawa largely on this climate issue, and hopefully that will have far-ranging effects far beyond Ottawa, that many more people in this wonderful country of ours would come to understand the good information that you're getting out about the real facts about climate change, about energy, and about our responsibility as stewards. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. That was fun.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.